Hi, this is Dr. Barbara Sirotnik. In the last video, I showed you how to form pivot tables to summarize your data, to put data into groupings and make it very easy to find out how many people said what. This time, what I'd like to do is to talk about how to calculate descriptive statistics for quantitative data. So I'll be showing you how to use Excel to calculate measures of central tendency or location, also measures of variation, how spread out the data are. And we'll talk about z-scores, which is again a way of locating where a data point happens to be. And we'll look at measures of relationship between two different variables. Of course, there's going to be a hard way and an easy way to do this. So let's begin by doing some descriptive statistics for annual charges. And if you take a look at this column F, these annual charges, we have charges for every one from row 2 down to row 126. In other words, we've got 125 people in the data set. So the first measure of central tendency is called the mean. This is the common average. What I'm going to do is to put equal average, and you'll notice that as I start typing the word average, there are several options that pop up to help me out. I'm going to hit the tab key for average. Now I have two different ways that I can find the average. The first way is I can simply highlight the data that I want averaged. It's going to go all the way down, and I'll just pull it down till I get to the last number that I want averaged, and there we go. As I scroll back up, you'll notice that F2 through F126 are in there. I'll close parentheses. Of course, if I had wanted to, I could have just typed F2 colon F126, and when I hit enter, there we go. That is the average annual charges. Now the mean is the common average. There's another average or measure of central tendency or location called the median. And that's the piece of data that has half the data above it and half the data below. How do I do that using Excel? Very simple, equal median, F2 colon F126. And a third measure of central tendency is called the mode. And that's the piece of data that occurs most often. Now, typically, if we have quantitative data like this, it's not overwhelmingly meaningful, but I'm going to go ahead and show you how you would do it in Excel anyway. And so I'm just going to put the word mode there, and we'll find it as equal mode, again, F2 up to F126. And it's telling us that 0 is the piece of data that occurs most often. So all of these three figures are measures of central tendency, or your book calls them measures of location. Now the next thing I want to do is to talk about measures of variation. And there's two measures that I want to demonstrate. The first is called the variance. And the variance is basically the average difference of each point to the mean. So for this variance, I'm going to type equal VAR, and please notice you're going to have two options of this VAR variance. The first is VARP for population. The second is VARS, which is sample. Well, in real life, I never have a population. I always deal with samples. So I'm going to go ahead and pick that one up. And again, I will just do F2 up to F126, and there we go. Now that number is huge, and that has no relationship with the charges that you see here in the F column. That's because the variance is the average squared difference of each point to the mean. So how do I get to something that looks more real? Well, I calculate something called the standard deviation, and that's going to be equal STDEV. Again, I have my choice of sample or population. I'm going to take the sample. That's going to be of F2 to F126, and now that number looks a lot more reasonable as a measure of spread in all of the data that we have here. Now, we've gone ahead and found measures of where the center of your data happen to be and how spread out the data are. There's actually an easier way of doing all of this if you happen to have a PC. If you have a Mac, unfortunately, you're out of luck. If you have a Mac, you have to do it the way I've just shown you. But if you happen to have a PC, there's a nice add-in called Data Analysis that you can use to make your life a lot easier. What I'm going to do is go into File, Options, and Add-ins. One of the add-ins is the Analysis Tool Pack, and that's the one that we're going to be using a lot throughout the class. When I click on Go after highlighting Analysis Tool Pack, it gives me another little window where I have to click Analysis Tool Pack and OK. Now at this point, if I click on Data, right up here on the top right, you will see the Data Analysis tool. And this is a very important tool because you can do all kinds of things such as descriptive statistics or correlation, which we'll see in a moment, or covariance, or lots of other things that we'll use in the course. For now, I'll select descriptive statistics. Now it asks me to put in the input range. And so my input range is going to be from F1 all the way down to F126. And you'll notice that I did include the label in the first row, so I'm going to click on that. Output range. That, the computer is asking me to say, where do I want to have the data put? So I'm going to go ahead and just simply click right here. That's the top left cell of where I want my information put. I'll also click on Summary Statistics. I'll click OK, and there we go. So let's see what this gives us. What this is going to give us, first of all, is some numbers that we've already seen. Numbers like the mean, and I'll go ahead and highlight that for you. It'll give you the median and the mode. We already found that step by step, but it does that all automatically. It'll also give you the standard deviation and the variance. It gives you all kinds of good stuff, all in one fell swoop. So it really is a very, very good thing that we can use. Now the next thing I want to tell you about is something called the z-score. And let's talk about what a z-score is. The z-score is a measure of distance from center. And what that is the point of interest, which I'll call x, minus the mean divided by the standard deviation. Basically, if that's a positive number, that means you're to the right of center. If it's a negative number, it's to the left of center. Let's go ahead and find the z-score for the maximum and minimum numbers, and I'll do a little more interpretation as we go along. So first of all, let's do the z-score for that maximum. And I think I'll put it right there. I'm going to say equal my minimum minus the mean, and I'm just clicking on the cell address to make it nice and easy, divided by the standard deviation. So I want to know how many standard deviations from center am I? Well, 0 is 11/6 away from center, but a standard deviation, the measure of spread, is 64/40. So it's not quite 2 standard deviations to the left. Actually, it's 1.8 standard deviations to the left. How about the maximum? Where is that relative to center? Well, again, I'll take my maximum minus the mean divided by the standard deviation. That tells me that I'm 3.63 standard deviations to the right of center. Now, how is that going to be helpful to me, knowing that it's 3.63? Well, it's helpful because an outlier is more than 3 standard deviations from center. That's the definition of an outlier. And an outlier is a point that's very unusual. It could be an error in your data entry, or it could just be simply a very unusual person, in this case, that charges an awful lot on their credit cards. So that's the z-score. Now, so far we've dealt with a single variable. It would be really nice if we could deal with 2 variables to look at the relationship between them. So what I'd like to do is to look at the relationship in this case between the variables which are going to be hours of watching television and annual charges. How am I going to do that? Through the correlation coefficient. So I'm going to say equal CORREL for correlation. When it asks for array 1, it's saying, tell me what's my first variable. Well, if my first variable is hours watching TV, that's going to be from E2 up to E126. I'll put a comma, and my second variable is charges. That's going to be F2 up to F126. Well, my correlation is 0.065. Oh joy, so what does that mean? Well, a correlation of 1 means perfect positive relationship. That would mean as hours watching TV goes up, annual charges go up, and it goes up in a perfect line. -1 would indicate a perfect negative correlation. That would mean as one variable goes up, the other drops, and again in a perfect line. A correlation of 0 means we really don't have much of a relationship. The points are all over the place. And that's the case here. Our correlation is only 0.065, very, very close to 0. And if indeed we want to graph this through a scatter diagram, we can go ahead and highlight our two variables. We can do an insert scatter, which is right here. And here's our scatter diagram. Oh, that's definitely far away from a perfect line. As a matter of fact, if I click on this plus and click on trend line, it's automatically putting a line in for me, and I can definitely see that there is no relationship between those two variables. So let's get rid of that. Well, instead of doing that, is there any relationship between income and annual charges? Theoretically, I would expect that the higher the income, the higher the charges. Well, let's do the calculation there. Equal correl. In this case, my income is B2 up to B126. I will relate that to annual charges, F2 up to F126. Correlation 0.6279, a lot closer to 1. So that's a much stronger linear relationship between the variables. Now, how am I going to graph that to be able to see that relationship? Well, the way I'm going to graph this relationship is I will go ahead and highlight all of my income. I'm going to hold down the Control key while I highlight this variable over here, my charges. If my two variables were next to each other, I wouldn't have to hold down the Control key and highlight like that, but they're not together, so that's the way I had to do it. Now I'm going to insert my scatter diagram, and there we go. And if indeed I put in my trend line now, I can see that it is an upward trend, and the points cluster a lot closer to a line. So now you have a basic idea of how to do basic descriptive statistics. We talked about measures of central tendency, measures of spread, location, and also relationship between two variables. Hope it all made sense.